Hey, what up? My name is Mariah Karina. I make videos about whatever tip I am on that week. And this week I've been thinking a lot about telos and the world stage. So I'm a person, maybe like many of you, who spend a lot of time, following what's going on in the world and responding with the full scale of emotions, right? Grief, outrage, sorrow, horror. But I went to this talk the other night by Richard Tarnas, and he evoked this idea that was originated by theologists, but that was popularized by Carl Jung, about a telos, or a teleology. And the idea of a telos is that there's a sense of meaning and purpose to the events that happen, that they're leading somewhere, that there's an ultimate arc of the universe that bends towards justice, as Martin Luther King says, or that bends towards the good winning out over the bad. And I was thinking about this because I've noticed that I too enjoy the practice of contextualizing the kind of historic moment that we're in, or my life, or us as a human species, or evolution in the cosmos, or whatever, within a teleological narrative. And I think there's something natural in the human pattern that does this. We like to think of ourselves in a hero's journey. That the challenges that we're facing now are serving this greater purpose of actualization in the future. And this sort of allows us to frame some of the challenging experiences that we go through, or some of the horrible things that happen in our own lives in the collective scale, as being a part of a greater narrative. And there's a lot of interesting intellectual work done about this, right? That meaning is not necessarily inherent in things, but that meaning can be made from things. And that as human beings, we're highly attuned to narrative. And so the stories that we're telling ourselves, about the different phenomena we encounter, matters. And even a sort of branch of activism that believes that if we had better stories, that this would somehow be able to unite us together again towards that hero's journey. So I'm all for narratives, I'm all for consciously playing with meaning making, all that kind of stuff I think is very interesting. However, what I noticed in myself is that I tend to reach for this idea of telos, or this idea of being a part of something greater, a greater hero's journey, when I am triggered. When I am triggered and reactive about the pain and the suffering, or the just absolute feelings of helplessness that I encounter. And that I use this idea of a telos. I use this narrative that I'm part of some mythic hero's journey, or that we all are, in two ways. The first is to soothe myself, right? I go, the Middle East is on fire. I think to myself something like, yes, like the forces of darkness are great, but the forces of the light shall win ultimately. Or I use it to get more reactive. I see that something is going on and I say, yes, this is why we need to get engaged. This is why we all need to unite and come together and mobilize, right? The forces of good must vanquish the forces of evil. So using telos in this way, either to soothe or to get myself more reactive, both come from this initial place of being already reactive and choosing the mechanism of this teleological narrative to either soothe myself and make me feel like it's okay to exist and like things are happening on schedule as planned, or to make myself more reactive and then to go out and act more, to get more involved, to rally the troops, whatever. And so I thought to explore a very blasphemous idea with you guys for a second, which is the possibility of what if there is no purpose? What if there is no point to all of this? And not in like a purely nihilistic way, right? But more in a way that collapses our sort of maybe knee-jerk reaction to make a story out of things. Like Baudrillard said that good and evil advance as part of the same moment. That it's all just kind of happening. Everything is just kind of happening. And that maybe it's all sort of doing itself. And I know this can sound very nihilistic, and sometimes to me it sounds that way, and it takes me back to the place of like, no, we need to believe there's a purpose because we need to be working to justice because these horrible things are happening. So I'm aware, but just put those aside for a second and let's just think, what if it's all happening? It's all just happening. And good and evil are all part of the same kind of mishmash of ever-changing fluxes of energies. God, I sound so hippie when I say that, but here's the thing. Because if there is no purpose, then there also is no problem, which I know is like triple double blasphemy, especially in my like very, activist orientation. But if you stick with me for a second, this idea there is no purpose and there is no problem. Because I actually think that problem is the language, the source and substance of the ego. It is an egoic function to view our lives as a problem, the world as a problem, and then we enlist our mind and we enlist our action and we try and solve it. And we think that we are the ones who need to solve it and who must solve it and who can solve it, which is all reaffirming that egoic sense of there's a problem and I must fix it. And this, if you think about it, is kind of like the crux of the hero's journey. There's a conflict that demands resolution, and we must find that depth of heroic potential in us in order to move through it. So it's a very individualistic and egotistical way of moving through life, which you can also tell by the fact that it's creating dichotomies of good and bad. And so the ego thinks it's doing it, and then it decides in another dichotomy whether it's succeeding at doing it, in which case you're on the side of the good, or failing at doing it, in which case you're on the side of the bad or the unworthy or whatever. And so actually there's something about seeing it as a problem, seeing ourselves as sort of responsible for it, that puts us back in that egoic place. And just for my own disclaimers, I am saying this as someone who I think actually does do a lot of social change work. Yeah, I do a lot of working on my internalized oppression, on my prejudice, on my relationships with people. I work with individuals and couples and groups and help them become aware of dynamics of power and oppression and privilege. I go on a lot of sort of solidarity trips and engage in a lot of different actions. And I've been thinking to myself, like, okay, if there is no telos, and there is no purpose, and everything is just sort of happening, and everything is kind of doing itself, if it wasn't part of a mythic battle of good versus evil, would I still do that? And for me, perhaps strangely, I feel that I would, but that I would be doing it from a very different place. I've been reading a lot of Adrienne Marie Brown, who wrote about pleasure activism, and this idea that activism can come from pleasure, and that pleasure itself is an activist act. And that even if you're in a position of privilege, relinquishing that privilege and giving reparations itself could also be pleasurable. And a lot of the things that we really need to weave a completely different way of being with each other and the world involve being in pleasurable relationship with things. And so when I imagine if I would do this stuff, even if there was no purpose, if there was no telos, if it wasn't like my job as an individual to like, heave ho the great scales of change in the direction of the good, I think I would still do it because those things actually are pleasurable. The depth, the connection, the passion of being engaged with them in the moment, the liberation that I feel when I uncover a new internalized oppression, the possible, like, real, deep human connection that happens when I can engage with someone across different lines of difference and cut through all that prejudice bullshit, the, actual experience of, let's say, going to Tijuana to do solidarity work with people who are seeking asylum in the United States. Even if there was no purpose to what I was doing, that experience, the relationships I had, the groups I got to be a part of, the information I got to be exposed to was worth it on its own terms as a source, strangely again, of pleasure. And part of what coming from pleasure does is it allows it, instead of being this struggle that we're either egoically succeeding or failing at, for me, feeling it as a source of pleasure and something that I would do anyway. It takes the fight and the struggle out of it. And so instead of, I think, the fear of letting go of meaning and purpose and telos would be that we fall into a kind of depressed nihilism. For me, being able to let go of the telos just allows me to relax into what is happening, to feel myself and to feel others and not be all contracted in the urgency of what has to happen now and what isn't happening. It allows me to celebrate and connect. And of course, a lot of this goes out the window whenever I hear about the fucking war or climate change or homophobia or whatever the fuck is fucking going on. And I get back in that contracted state, and then I might use that narrative teleological device to either soothe myself or inspire myself for more reaction. But I'm trying to catch myself when I do that. I'm trying to come back to this place of, like, I genuinely do want to live in a different relationship with the earth. From a place of pleasure, how can I engage? in changing that. And so I guess what I'm saying is that to unite with my contemporaries who are on the pleasure activism tip, that I think pleasure can be just as good a fuel for creating social change as telos, and maybe even better, because it'll show us what we're naturally and authentically drawn towards, what our own gifts to share are, and make us more open and accepting of other people's. That it's actually embodying the change that I want to see more than when I'm coming from telos, more when I'm coming from that more egoic place of good and bad, and that I am the one that is doing it, as opposed to surrendering into this pleasure, and that there's something that is moving me that I can listen to, that I can follow, and that I can support and empower in other people.